June 1, 2009. An overnight flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. Air France Flight 447, an Airbus A330-203, prepares for departure. The aircraft, one of the most advanced in the skies, is equipped with state-of-the-art technology designed to make long-haul flights smoother and safer than ever before. The crew, experienced and well-trained, performs their final checks before takeoff. For the 216 passengers and 12 crew members, it is supposed to be a routine transatlantic journey. But what lies ahead is anything but routine. A shot inside the cockpit shows the pilots going through their pre-flight checklist. Captain Marc Dubois, a seasoned pilot with over 11,000 flight hours, sits in the left seat, overseeing the preparations. His two co-pilots, First Officer Pierre-Cedric Bonin and First Officer David Robert, assist him. They are unaware that they will be facing one of the most mysterious and tragic disasters in modern aviation. Captain Dubois, calmly, checklist complete, ready for pushback. Air traffic control, ATC, over radio. Air France 447, you are cleared for takeoff, runway 10. Have a good flight. First Officer Bonin, cleared for takeoff, runway 10. Merci. The engines roar as the Airbus A330 powers down the runway. The aircraft lifts off smoothly, ascending into the evening sky. The view from the cockpit shows the twinkling lights of Rio de Janeiro fading into the distance as Flight 447 climbs towards its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Narrator. The first hours of the flight are uneventful. The aircraft cruises over the Atlantic Ocean, passengers settling in for the long journey ahead. The cabin is quiet, some passengers watching movies, others already asleep. The pilots monitor the instruments, making small adjustments as necessary. Nothing appears out of the ordinary. A shot of the flight attendants serving meals, passengers chatting, a child looking out the window at the vast ocean below. The mood is peaceful, unaware of the danger approaching. Narrator. But nearly 2 hours into the flight, conditions begin to change. Ahead lies a massive equatorial storm system, common in this region of the Atlantic. The pilots are aware of the turbulence ahead, but storms like these are a routine part of transatlantic travel. Modern aircraft, including the Airbus A330, are designed to handle turbulence with ease. The crew decides to make a slight course adjustment to avoid the worst of the storm. A shot of the cockpit shows the radar display, highlighting a large storm system ahead. The pilots communicate with each other, discussing their approach. First Officer Bonin, pointing at radar screen, looks like we have some heavy turbulence ahead. Adjusting course slightly to the left. Captain Dubois, nodding, good call. Keep monitoring it. Narrator. As the aircraft continues on its adjusted course, the passengers remain unaware of the changes. The seatbelt sign is illuminated, a routine precaution as the aircraft approaches turbulence. The pilots remain calm, confident in their ability to navigate through the weather. A close-up of the digital flight displays, showing minor altitude and heading adjustments. The cockpit is dimly lit, the glow of the screens reflecting off the pilots' faces. Narrator. But as Flight 447 presses on, an unseen threat is developing. Outside, high above the Atlantic, the temperature is dropping rapidly. Tiny ice crystals begin forming on the aircraft's pitot tubes, small but critical sensors that measure airspeed. These tubes are designed to withstand extreme conditions, but under certain rare circumstances, they can become clogged with ice, feeding incorrect speed data to the flight computers. A slow-motion animation shows ice forming inside the pitot tubes, gradually blocking them. The aircraft's flight computers unknowingly begin receiving unreliable data. Narrator. At precisely 2:10 a.m., the autopilot disengages. Without warning, the aircraft switches to manual flight mode, forcing the pilots to take full control. A chime sounds in the cockpit, signaling the sudden disconnection of automated systems. The pilots glance at each other, momentarily confused. First Officer Bonin, frowning, what just happened? Autopilot's off. First Officer Robert, I see it. Flight control law just changed. Narrator. In that instant, the entire nature of the flight changes. The advanced systems that usually assist the pilots in maintaining stability are no longer available. Flight 447 is now relying solely on human control, and the crew must react quickly. But with incorrect speed readings, their response will set off a catastrophic chain of events. As Flight 447 enters the turbulent storm system, the pilots brace for rough air. They have navigated such weather before, and their aircraft is built to withstand it. But unbeknownst to them, a small but crucial failure is already underway. The aircraft's pitot tubes, tiny but vital sensors that measure airspeed, are icing over, sending incorrect data to the flight computers. A slow-motion animation illustrates the pitot tubes freezing, disrupting the airflow. The digital flight display flickers slightly, reflecting inconsistent readings. The autopilot, programmed to rely on this data, can no longer function properly. Narrator. At precisely 2:10 a.m., without warning, the autopilot disengages. The aircraft abruptly switches to manual control, and a chime sounds in the cockpit. The pilots, momentarily startled, glance at each other, their calm demeanor shifting to concern. First Officer Bonin, frowning, autopilot's off. First Officer Robert. Flight control law just changed. We're in alternate law. Captain Dubois, returning from a short break, confused. What's going on? The aircraft, now flying manually in turbulent weather, begins to feel unstable. The pilots, unaware of the faulty airspeed readings, struggle to assess the situation. A sudden jolt of turbulence shakes the cockpit. Narrator. With the autopilot disengaged, the pilots must fly the aircraft manually. Normally, this would not be a major issue, but they're faced with conflicting speed indications. The airspeed data, critical for maintaining stability, is unreliable. The pilots don't realize they are receiving false readings. The camera zooms in on the instrument panel, where airspeed indicators show inconsistent values. The numbers fluctuate erratically, confusing the crew. First Officer Bonin, gripping the controls. I'm pulling back. We need to climb. First Officer Robert, concerned. Wait, no, don't climb too much. We could lose speed. Narrator. In the absence of reliable airspeed data, the pilots rely on instinct. Bonin, the least experienced of the three, unknowingly makes a fatal mistake. Believing the aircraft is descending too quickly, he pulls back on the stick, raising the nose of the plane. A computer-generated animation shows the aircraft's pitch increasing. The nose rises, but with little thrust adjustment, the airspeed continues to drop. The aircraft, still climbing, is unknowingly entering an aerodynamic stall. Narrator. A critical misunderstanding unfolds. Instead of stabilizing, the aircraft begins to lose lift. The angle of attack increases beyond safe limits, and the plane enters a stall. Without realizing it, the crew has set the aircraft into a dangerous situation, one that will soon become irreversible. The cockpit alarms suddenly blare. A synthetic voice repeatedly announces the terrifying warning, stall, stall. First Officer Bonin, panicked, still pulling back. What's happening? First Officer Robert. We're stalling. Lower the nose. Narrator. But the warnings only add to the confusion. With turbulence shaking the aircraft and alarms blaring, the pilots are overwhelmed. They fail to recognize the most fundamental rule in aviation recovery. To escape a stall, they need to push the nose down, not up. The scene cuts to the passenger cabin. Some passengers sleep, unaware of the growing emergency. Others stir as the turbulence worsens. A few exchange nervous glances, but no one realizes the plane is now in freefall. Narrator. As seconds tick by, the aircraft's descent rate increases. It is now plummeting toward the ocean at an alarming rate, over 10,000 feet per minute. The pilots remain disoriented, their instincts leading them in the wrong direction. Captain Dubois, realizing the gravity of the situation. What's our altitude? What's happening? First Officer Robert, checking instruments, voice tense. We're at 30,000 feet and falling fast. We need to recover now. Narrator. The aircraft is in a deadly state, spiraling out of controlled flight. They still have time to recover, but only if they act correctly. Yet, the stall warning continues, the controls feel sluggish, and the dark storm clouds obscure their reference to the horizon. They are flying blind in one of the most perilous situations imaginable. Flight 447 is now in freefall. The Airbus A330, a state-of-the-art aircraft, is nosed up at an extreme angle, its engines still running but unable to generate enough lift. The aerodynamic stall is in full effect, and instead of flying, the aircraft is sinking through the air like a stone. But inside the cockpit, the crew is still unaware of the full extent of their situation. First Officer Bonin, panicked. "We're still climbing, right?" First Officer Robert, urgently checking instruments. "No, we're descending. We're falling fast." Narrator. The airspeed indicators remain unreliable, and the pilots are relying on instinct rather than correct procedures. The stall warning continues to sound, but it stops intermittently, adding to their confusion. Without realizing it, Bonin is still pulling back on the controls, worsening the stall rather than correcting it. A shot of the aircraft from the outside, showing it descending through the storm, lightning flashing in the background. Inside the cockpit, Captain Dubois, the most experienced of the three, struggles to regain authority over the situation. Captain Dubois, assertive, but tense. "Let me take control.
Push the nose down.
We need to regain airspeed." Narrator. But it is too late. The aircraft has already lost nearly 25,000 feet in just a few minutes. The altimeter ticks downward at an alarming rate. The engines are running at full thrust, but the plane is no longer flying, it is dropping. First Officer Robert, desperately searching for solutions. "We're at 20,000 feet. We need to recover now." Narrator. By this point, the aircraft is in a deep stall. The wings cannot generate enough lift, and the nose remains too high. Every second that passes brings them closer to disaster. The vast, dark Atlantic Ocean awaits below. The pilots continue fighting the controls, but the aircraft is barely responding. A final warning alarm blares, a synthetic voice repeating the dreaded phrase, "Stall, stall, stall." Captain Dubois, yelling over alarms. "Nose down. Push it down now." First Officer Bonin, frantic, confused. "I'm trying. I don't understand what's happening." Narrator. Then, at 10,000 feet, an eerie calm spreads through the cockpit. The stall warning stops, silenced not because they have recovered, but because they are now too deep into the fall for the system to register the stall properly. The aircraft continues its rapid descent, but without the familiar warnings, the pilots are even more disoriented. The camera shifts to the passenger cabin, some passengers now awake, gripping their armrests. Some whisper prayers. Others remain unaware of the true horror unfolding. Outside, the Atlantic looms closer. Narrator. At 2:14 a.m., Flight 447 reaches its final moments. The pilots make one last desperate attempt to regain control, but the situation is beyond saving. The ocean is just seconds away. The aircraft remains tilted, its nose still too high, unable to recover from the stall. First Officer Robert, grimly, realizing their fate. "We're going to hit." Narrator. Then, at 2:14 and 28 seconds a.m., after a terrifying 3-minute freefall, Air France Flight 447 slams into the Atlantic Ocean at nearly 11,000 feet per minute. The impact is catastrophic, breaking the aircraft into pieces instantly. None of the 228 people on board survive. The screen fades to black. The once chaotic cockpit is now silent. The ocean, deep and vast, swallows the remains of the aircraft, leaving behind nothing but darkness. Narrator. The wreckage of Flight 447 disappears beneath the waves. For nearly 2 years, it remains lost, hidden in one of the most remote parts of the Atlantic Ocean. Families mourn without answers, and investigators are left with more questions than explanations. What truly happened that night? How did one of the most technologically advanced aircraft in the world simply vanish? The search for the truth is about to begin. For nearly 2 years, the fate of Air France Flight 447 remains a mystery. With no survivors and no distress call, investigators are left with little to work with. Families of the victims grieve without answers, their pain magnified by the uncertainty of what happened in the final moments of the flight. The camera shifts to news footage from June 2009, grim-faced officials, grieving relatives waiting in airports, and rescue ships searching the ocean for any sign of wreckage. News reporter, voiceover. Air France Flight 447 disappeared over the Atlantic in the early hours of June 1, 2009. The search is now underway, but the aircraft's last known position places it in one of the most remote areas on Earth. Narrator. Rescue and recovery efforts begin almost immediately, but the ocean offers few clues. Small pieces of floating debris are spotted within days, and a few bodies are recovered from the water. But the most crucial elements, the flight recorders and the majority of the wreckage, remain lost in the depths of the ocean. An animation shows the vast search area, highlighting the difficulty of locating the wreckage in such a deep and expansive region. Sonar scans, deep-sea submersibles, and aircraft scour the ocean, but the wreckage remains elusive. Narrator. Months pass, and hope begins to fade. Without the black boxes, investigators can only speculate on what led to the sudden and catastrophic loss of Flight 447. Theories range from severe turbulence to a total electrical failure. But with no concrete evidence, the true cause remains unknown. A shift to an interview with a family member of one of the passengers, their voice heavy with grief. Family member. We just want to know what happened. We want to know why they didn't make it home. Narrator. Determined to find answers, the French Bureau of Investigation and Analysis, BEA, continues its relentless search. In 2011, nearly 2 years after the crash, a breakthrough is finally made. Using advanced deep-sea search technology, investigators locate the wreckage of Flight 447, resting nearly 13,000 feet below the ocean surface. Underwater footage from remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, shows haunting images of the broken fuselage lying on the ocean floor. The wreckage, eerily intact in some places, offers the first real glimpse into what happened. Narrator. The discovery of the wreckage allows investigators to recover the long-lost black boxes, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. These devices hold the final moments of the doomed flight, and for the first time, the truth is within reach. A close-up of the recovered black boxes being carefully analyzed by experts. Engineers and investigators huddle over computers, reviewing the data. Narrator. As the data is analyzed, a chilling series of events unfolds. The recordings reveal the confusion in the cockpit, the failure of the pitot tubes, and the pilot's struggle to regain control. The sequence of errors leading to the stall becomes clear. The aircraft was never in danger of breaking apart. The loss of control was entirely preventable. A clip of an aviation expert explaining the significance of the findings. Aviation expert. What we found was a tragic case of human error, exacerbated by a lack of proper training for such an event. The aircraft was flyable until the very last moment, but the pilots did not recognize the stall for what it was. Narrator. The investigation concludes that Flight 447 crashed due to a combination of technical failure and human error. The frozen pitot tubes provided incorrect airspeed readings, and in response, the pilots unknowingly placed the aircraft into a stall that they never recovered from. Overlay of headlines announcing the findings: Flight 447 crash due to human error, new training standards for pilots after Air France disaster. Narrator. The crash of Flight 447 sparks major changes in aviation. Airlines worldwide update their training programs, placing greater emphasis on manual flight skills and stall recovery techniques. Airbus redesigns the pitot tube system to prevent future failures. The aviation industry learns a painful lesson, one that will hopefully prevent similar tragedies in the future. Scenes of modern flight simulators, pilots undergoing rigorous training, and improved aircraft systems being tested. Narrator. But for the families of those on board, no safety reform can bring back their loved ones. The wreckage may have been found, and the cause may have been determined, but the loss remains immeasurable. A final shot of a memorial plaque dedicated to the victims of Flight 447. Flowers are laid at the base, and names are etched in stone, forever remembered. Narrator. Air France Flight 447 remains one of the most haunting aviation disasters in modern history. A flight that should have landed safely in Paris instead ended in the depths of the Atlantic. The tragedy serves as a stark reminder of the fragile balance between technology and human decision-making, one that, in this case, tipped towards disaster.